between 50,000 and 200,000 women vanished into a network of military brothels, forced to service up to 60 soldiers per day. Yet when liberation finally came in 1945, they feared their rescuers more than their captors. The pale winter sun rises over a small Philippine village in January 1945, casting shadows through barbed wire onto wooden structures where 23 women huddle on thin straw mats, their hollow eyes fixed on walls as American artillery grows louder in the distance. Each woman wears a numbered cotton yukata like cattle, their faces Korean, Chinese, Filipino, all sharing the same vacant 1,000-yard stare of those who've lived too long in hell. Rain patters against tin roofs while shells explode closer by the hour, and for these women euphemistically called comfort women by their Japanese captors, the approaching American forces bring neither hope nor fear, just numb anticipation of what new masters might bring. The brutal system began in 1932 when the Japanese Imperial Army started establishing comfort stations across occupied territories in Asia with bureaucratic precision. Women were recruited through calculated deception, promised factory work to support the war effort, nursing positions, or legitimate employment opportunities that never existed. A Korean girl named Min, just 17 years old, left her village believing she'd be operating machinery in a textile factory, carrying only a jade pendant from her grandmother and dreams of sending money home to her family. The term comfort women itself was propaganda, a sanitized euphemism designed to disguise systematic rape as some sort of morale service. These stations operated with military efficiency, complete with schedules, mandatory medical protocols to prevent disease spread, and official transport documents treating human trafficking as routine logistics. Recent controversies in 2025 show scholars like Professor Yuha Park faced legal battles for presenting nuanced research, though the suffering remained universal and undeniable across all circumstances. Life inside these stations stripped away every shred of humanity from the women trapped there. They were numbered like inventory, forced to service anywhere from 15 to 60 soldiers, daily in squalid conditions that would break even the strongest spirit. Medical examinations documented cigarette burns scarring their skin, untreated wounds left to fester, and widespread venereal diseases resulting from repeated sexual trauma without protection or care. Japanese soldiers openly called them public toilets, reducing human beings to objects for bodily functions. The statistics are staggering and horrific. Only about 10% of these women survived the war, with many killed by retreating Japanese forces who saw them as loose ends to tie up before surrender. Years of this treatment created psychological conditioning so complete that these women expected nothing but exploitation. Their survival instincts recalibrated to accept daily violation as normal existence. Some women were raped so many times they lost count, their bodies becoming numb, their minds retreating to distant places just to endure another day in this industrialized nightmare. As American forces pushed through the Philippines in early 1945, they advanced with no knowledge of what awaited them behind the bamboo walls of Japanese military installations. Young soldiers, farm boys from Nebraska, and factory workers from Detroit had been trained to expect fierce resistance, hidden mines, booby traps, and kamikaze attacks. But nothing in their preparation mentioned finding shell-shocked women in military brothels. Japanese commanders filled the women's heads with horrific propaganda as defeat grew inevitable, telling them Americans were cannibals who would eat them alive, that they'd be tortured and mutilated if captured by these monsters. Some women received cyanide pills as a final gift from their captors, while others huddled in dugouts knowing hand grenades might come rolling in at any moment. At Saipan, comfort women jumped off cliffs alongside Japanese civilians and soldiers, choosing death over the horrors they'd been promised would come from American hands. Reports surfaced of Korean comfort women in Burma taking those cyanide pills or dying when grenades exploded in their shelters as Japanese forces retreated. These women faced an impossible choice: end their own lives or wait for what they truly believed would be even worse monsters than the ones who'd enslaved them for years. February 3rd, 1945, a small Philippine village falls to American forces after surprisingly light resistance. Staff Sergeant James Miller leads his squad through systematic searches of the abandoned garrison, his boots crunching on shattered glass as he approaches the last building in the compound. The door creaks open, and the smell hits him first. Unwashed bodies, human waste, and desperation so thick it makes him gag. As his eyes adjust to the darkness, he sees huddled forms of women pressed against the far wall, some covering their faces, others staring back with completely empty eyes that have seen too much. His finger relaxes on the trigger of his M1 Garand rifle as he whispers to his squad to get the medic. Because this isn't enemy combatants, this is something his training never prepared him for. An American medic approaches Min slowly, crouching to her level instead of standing over her, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He offers her a canteen of water and a chocolate bar, simple items that nonetheless represent the first gifts she's received in 2 years that didn't come with expectations of sexual servitude in return. The women watch with complete confusion, conditioned by years to expect all soldiers to use their bodies, yet these men in different uniforms are calling for medical help instead. What happened next shattered every expectation those women had been taught to hold. American military protocols strictly prohibited sexual contact with local women in occupied territories, with enforcement varying by unit, but representing official policy nonetheless. Female medical teams were quickly assembled because comfort women would scream at the mere sight of male uniforms, their trauma so deep that any man in military dress triggered panic responses. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison documented what they found near Manila in his official report: women severely malnourished, showing signs of systematic physical abuse, including those cigarette burns and untreated injuries. Medical examinations revealed the full horror: widespread venereal diseases and infections from repeated sexual trauma, plus acute psychological distress that made them refuse treatment initially because they believed American medical personnel would harm them too. Army nurse Lieutenant Sarah Daniels recalled decades later in her memoir that the women wouldn't let any male personnel near them at first, and they had to create all-female medical teams whenever possible because the women were terrified they were simply being prepared for American soldiers. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Where Japanese forces had institutionalized sexual slavery as military policy, American forces responded with medical care, food rations freely given, and protection rather than exploitation. Former comfort woman Kim Hakson explained in a 1991 interview that they were completely prepared to continue their lives as comfort women under American control. And when they realized these soldiers had no such intentions, many women broke down in tears from relief and confusion. After years of daily rape becoming normalized existence, the absence of violation was itself a profound shock that forced them to reconsider every survival assumption they'd built. Physical freedom didn't equal true liberation for these women, because invisible prisons awaited them back home. Cultural attitudes toward female sexuality and purity created stigma so powerful that many survivors chose not to return to their communities after liberation, fearing rejection and ostracism from the very families they'd been trying to support. In societies that prized female chastity above all else, these women were viewed as permanently defiled, damaged goods that brought shame rather than sympathy. Min sits in a recovery center 2 months after liberation, her physical wounds healing with regular meals, filling out the hollows in her cheeks. But her eyes still dart nervously when male voices carry from hallways. An American female interpreter approaches with a clipboard explaining the Red Cross wants to help locate her family and asking if she wishes to return home. The word home feels as distant as childhood, because how can she face her village carrying the shame of what was done to her? How can she look her grandmother in the eye, knowing the uses to which her body was put? Translation difficulties and cultural barriers complicated American aid efforts, even as occupation authorities worked to repatriate displaced persons throughout Asia. Many women found new paths, becoming translators for occupation forces, working for relief organizations, using language skills acquired during captivity to forge identities based on their minds rather than their bodies. Min makes a surprising decision, applying to work as a translator since her facility with Japanese, Korean, and now English makes her valuable in ways having nothing to do with her body. The sound of American military boots in hallways no longer triggers her flight response, and in this normally where her intellect is valued, she begins reclaiming something the war nearly extinguished. But here's where the story takes a hypocritical turn that reveals how limited the understanding of sexual exploitation really was in the immediate post-war period. While American forces had helped liberate comfort women throughout Asia and were genuinely horrified by what they found, the occupation authorities in Japan tacitly permitted establishment of a remarkably similar system for their own troops. With approval from occupation authorities, the Japanese government established the Recreation and Amusement Association, known as RAA, which recruited Japanese women to work in brothels specifically serving American soldiers. This system was technically voluntary, unlike the forced conscription of comfort women, but it was born of the same power imbalances and economic desperation that made true consent questionable at best. American leadership applied different moral standards to arrangements that benefited their own forces, failing to recognize that exploitation doesn't become acceptable just because it's dressed up with different paperwork. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal did address some Japanese war crimes after the war ended, but the comfort women system received shockingly insufficient attention, considering its massive scale. Most perpetrators escaped prosecution entirely. Japanese officers who organized and profited from systematic rape simply returned to civilian life without facing any consequences for their crimes. This failure of justice would have lasting implications, setting precedents that allowed denial to fester for decades to come. The Japanese government denied official involvement in the comfort station system for nearly 50 years after the war ended, claiming these were private brothels rather than military institutions, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Survivors maintained silence even from their own spouses and children, carrying their trauma alone because the shame was too great to speak aloud in societies that would blame them rather than their abusers. It wasn't until the early 1990s that surviving women finally broke their silence in significant numbers, stepping forward publicly to demand acknowledgement and compensation for what was done to them. The 1990s brought a wave of testimony as elderly women decided they had little left to lose and everything to gain by finally telling their stories before death silenced them forever. In 2015, Japan provided an $8.3 million compensation fund that critics immediately condemned as inadequate, given the scale of suffering and the decades of denial that preceded it. As of 2025, the last surviving comfort women in Asia are still seeking justice, their numbers dwindling with each passing year as time does what war and trauma couldn't quite accomplish. Recent debates over memorial accuracy and how to teach this history continue sparking fierce controversy, with some arguing for historical nuance, while survivors insist their lived experiences shouldn't be subjected to academic nitpicking. Professor Yuha Park faced legal challenges in South Korea for research that some felt gave too much complexity to a story that should remain black and white. The wounds remain unresolved, the pain unhealed, as the last survivors enter their final years still fighting for the full acknowledgement that has been denied for 8 decades. Between 50,000 and 200,000 women, the numbers themselves contested and uncertain, were forced into this system of sexual slavery. Only about 10% survived to see liberation. And of those survivors, many carried lifelong physical consequences, including sterility from untreated infections and psychological wounds that never fully healed. The American restraint that Min and others experienced offered a glimpse of a different kind of world, where men in power might choose not to abuse it, where military force didn't automatically mean sexual exploitation. Those chocolate bars freely given, that medical care provided without expectation of payment through bodies, represented a profound psychological shift for women who'd been taught that all soldiers were predators. Small acts of human decency became revolutionary when measured against years of dehumanization. Min's jade pendant, that small piece of stone she managed to keep hidden throughout her ordeal, came to symbolize something profound about human resilience. Like that pendant surviving despite everything, something essential within the human spirit resists complete erasure, maintaining the possibility of renewal even after the most profound violations. The freedom that arrived with liberation was never complete or uncomplicated. These women carried wounds for life, just as their societies carried the moral debt of failing to acknowledge their suffering. But in those moments when expected exploitation didn't materialize, when American soldiers responded to vulnerability with restraint rather than predation, a different kind of liberation became possible. Not just freedom from physical chains, but freedom to imagine a world where human dignity might one day be universally honored, regardless of gender or circumstance. The story reminds us that while humanity's capacity for cruelty can seem bottomless, running from industrialized sexual slavery to decades of institutional denial, our capacity for resilience, compassion, and hope runs just as deep. In history's endless fields of atrocities, these moments of unexpected kindness stand like small green shoots, not erasing the devastation around them, but testifying to the possibility that even after the most profound violations, the human spirit can begin again.